Okay, so one of the things we need to be able to do to complete the square is recognize and factor our perfect square trinomials. The goal with completing the square is to make one side of the equation a perfect square so we can use algebra to solve. So if we have x squared minus 2x plus 1, we can factor that using our big X if we want. What two numbers multiply to 1 and add to negative 2? Negative 1 and negative 1. So I could write that as x minus 1 times x minus 1. To rewrite it as a square of a binomial, I just write it once, x minus 1, and I put the square on it. Okay. What do we get for the next one? 25 and 10. What numbers multiply to 25 and add to 10? 5 and 5. So that's x plus 5 and x plus 5, which we can write as x plus 5 squared. Now when we have a coefficient, we use a little guess and check. Okay, so 3x and 3x. If we're talking about completing the square and perfect square trinomials, it's probably going to work if I use 3 times 3 and 4 times 4. So let's test that first, right? So, 2 and 2. That gives me 6x for my outside, 6x for my inside. If I want it to equal negative 12, what sign do I have to use? Negatives, right? So then that's 3x minus 2 squared. So, one thing we can notice is if I look at my constant here, 25 is 5 squared. The middle is 2 times 5. That's going to be a perfect square trinomial. When I look at here, 3 and 2, 9 is 3 squared, 4 is 2 squared. When I multiply that together and then multiply by 2, I get the 12 in the middle. That's kind of what you're looking for to see if it's a perfect square. Now we can use that factoring ability to solve these quadratics that already have a perfect square on the left with the square root property. Okay. So how does x squared minus 6x plus 9 factor? Let's use our x. 9, negative 6. What two numbers multiply to 9 and add to negative 6? Negative 3 and negative 3. So my right side can be rewritten as x minus 3 squared equals 7. Now, how can I solve that? Oops, wait, that doesn't equal 7, it equals 49. I got ahead of myself. I want to undo the square, so I'm going to take the square root of both sides. Always make sure you put a plus or minus in front when you're taking the square root, right? Because whatever is in that parentheses could be positive 7 or negative 7, and when I square it, I'm going to get positive 49. So we have x minus 3 equals plus or minus 7. Now what? I can add my 3, right? And x is equal to 3 plus or minus 7. It doesn't become plus or minus 10 because it's 3 plus 7 and 3 minus 7, right? I don't like to write two equations. That's too much extra work. That's too much extra writing, right? I'm going to put the 3 in front of my plus or minus, and then I'm going to do 3 plus 7 is 10, and 3 minus 7, negative 4. Those are my two answers. I see a lot of people leaving off the plus and minus, so then you're getting one answer, looking at the answer key going, Where did that second answer come from? Right? It's because when we take the square root of both sides, we have to have plus or minus. Okay, can we try number 2? How does the left side factor? Well, everything's positive, so I think it's going to be positives. Let's test it out. 2x and 2x, 1 and 1. Right? To get 4, I can do 2 times 2. To get 1, it's going to be 1 times 1. My outside is 2x, my inside is 2x. So that gives me 4x, right? If they're both positive. So 2x plus 1 squared equals 25. Now what do I do? Square root. Plus or minus the square root of 25. 2x plus 1 equals plus or minus 5. Now what? Minus 1. 2x equals negative 1 plus or minus 5. Divide by the 2. And x equals negative 1 plus or minus 5 over 2. So that's negative 1 plus 5, 4 over 2. Negative 1 minus 5, negative 6 over 2, which is 2 and negative 3. Can you take a second and try number 3? Factor the left side. Okay, so x squared minus 14x plus 49 factors to what? X minus 7 squared. And we're going to take the square root of both sides, plus or minus. Every time I take the square root of both sides to solve an equation, I need a plus or minus. So x minus 7 equals plus or minus 8 is 4 times 2, right? So that's 2i radical 2. You can simplify that radical. And then we're going to add 7 in front of our plus or minus. So x is 7 plus or minus 2i radical 2. And I can't do anything else with that. I can't add imaginary numbers to real numbers. The 7 is real. The 2i radical 2 is imaginary. So I can't put them together. Okay, and that's my final answer. Okay, so some of the problems on tonight's homework will have it like this, where you can factor it and then solve using the square root property. But sometimes we have to make it a perfect square so we can factor and use the square root property. Again, like we did in the warm-up, the formula to get c to make it a perfect square is the b term divided by 2 and square it. Okay, so take a second. I want you to find your c's for 4, 5, and 6, just like we did in the warm-up. Okay, so let's look at number 4. 18, negative 18 divided by 2 squared. 9 squared is 81. If I'm going to write this, it becomes x squared minus 18x plus 81, and that becomes x minus 9 squared. Isn't that how it factors? So we're making this polynomial a perfect square so that we can then factor it. Right? What two numbers multiplied 81 and add to negative 18? Negative 9 and negative 9, right? That's not as easy as the next one that has a fraction in it. If I take my b1 divided by 2 and square it, 1 squared is 1, 2 squared is 4. Okay, then I can write this as x squared plus x plus 1/4. Not a lot of us look at that and say, oh yeah, I know what two numbers multiply to 1/4 and add to 1. But the answer is in what I got when I divided my b by 2. Isn't 1/2 times 1/2 1/4? Isn't 1/2 plus 1/2 1? Yes. So this factors as x plus 1/2 squared. And number 6, 5 divided by 2 squared, 5 squared is 25, 2 squared is 4. That's x squared plus 5x plus 25 fourths, which is going to factor to x plus 5 halves squared. Isn't 5 over 2 plus 5 over 2 equal to 5? 5 over 2 plus 5 over 2 is 10 over 2, which equals 5. And when I squared it, when I multiplied it by itself, I got 25 fourths. So that b over 2 is going to be how it factors, and it's especially important when they're fractions, right? That's our trick to doing it quickly. Okay. All right, we're on the side. So we're going to use the same idea. We're going to solve by completing the square. One of the rules that has to happen is our coefficient has to be equal to 1 on the x squared term. Okay, and we'll talk about that in a second. So, first thing we do, we check to see if it's a perfect square. Then, we're going to make sure that we get the x squared a coefficient of 1. Then we're going to move our old c to the other side. We're going to find our new c by using the formula b over 2 squared. We're going to add that to both sides of the equation. Then we're going to factor it and solve it like we did on the front side. Okay. So let's start. H squared minus 10h plus 9. Well, 9's a perfect square, right? But 3 plus 3 is not equal to 10, right? So this is not a perfect square. Would you agree? Okay. Is my coefficient equal to 1? Yes. Now I'm going to move my old c, which is what number? The 9 to the other side. When I rewrite it, I want to leave space for the new c. Okay? So h squared minus 10h, I like to do plus a blank, equals negative 9 plus a blank space. Whatever I add to one side of the equation, I have to add to the other. So if I'm going to find a c that's going to make this perfect square, I not only need space to put it in between the plus sign and the equal, but I also have to add it to the other side. So I just like to leave a little blank space there to remind me to put it on both sides, because that's like one of the biggest mistakes people make. What's the value of c that makes this a perfect square? Right, negative 10 divided by 2 squared, 25, right? Just like we did a second ago. So I'm going to add 25 to both sides of the equation. Now I can factor. H squared minus 10h plus 25 factors to h minus 5 squared, right? Negative 5 and negative 5 multiply to negative 10 and add to 25. And what's negative 9 plus 25? 16. Now I can solve. Okay, take a second. Solve this just like we did on the front side. All right, when I'm solving, I'm taking the square root of both sides, plus or minus the square root of the 16. H minus 5 equals plus or minus 4. Add 5. H is 5 plus or minus 4, which equals 5 plus 4, 5 minus 4, 1, right? All right, let's look at number 2 here. Does it look like a perfect square? No, right? 6 is not even a perfect square, so that's not going to work, right? Does the coefficient on the y squared equal 1? Yes. Okay, so what's my next step? What am I going to move to the other side? The 6. So we're going to add 6. I get y squared minus y plus my blank space equals 6 plus a blank space for the new c. How do I find my new c? Negative 1 over 2 squared, which is positive 1/4. Oh yeah, I know. I could have factored it. But that's not what I'm trying to teach you to do today. I'm trying to teach you how to solve using completing the square. And I'm trying to teach you how to deal with the fraction if it comes up. So, they're not all going to come out as whole numbers, but sometimes it's easier to start with the ones that have whole number answers. So if I factor this, it's going to be y minus 1/2 squared. Okay, this number, if it's a fraction, is how it factors. Okay, and 6 plus 1/4, 6 over 1, times by 4 over 4, 24/4 plus 1/4 is 25/4. Now how do I solve it? Square root both sides. Plus or minus the square root. There's a reason I didn't leave that as 6 1/4. I don't know the square root of 6 1/4, but I can take the square root of 25/4. What do I get? 5 over 2. So y minus 1/2 equals plus or minus 5 over 2. When I'm taking the square root of a fraction, it's square root of the top, square root of the bottom, especially if they're perfect squares. And then we're going to add 1/2. Y equals 1/2 plus or minus 5/2. So that's 1 plus 5 over 2, 6/2. 1 minus 5, negative 4 over 2, 3, and negative 2. Oh, sorry. It's just a default. My brain defaults to X, usually. I don't know why I even try using other letters. I try to change it up, and then my brain always defaults it to an X. All right, so now let's look at what do we do. What do we do if it's not a perfect square, because 6, 12, and 24, none of those are perfect squares, right? And my x squared has a coefficient. So in order to deal with that, we're going to divide everything by 6. So we just divide by 6, and we get x squared plus 2x plus 4 equals 0. Okay. So when there's a coefficient, you divide everything by it. Hopefully it goes in evenly. Okay. We usually give you problems that go in evenly, otherwise the fractions are pretty gnarly. And that's when we say, we don't really like completing the square for this method. Okay. Eventually, we're going to be able to look at the problems and say, factoring, that factors, I'm going to use that method because it's the fastest, right? Or I can solve this using the square root property. And if you can't use either of those, then you revert to completing the square, and then ultimately quadratic formula is like our last resort. So what do? Still not a perfect square trinomial, right? because 2 plus 2, 2 times 2 is 4, but 2 plus 4 is not 2. So what's my next step? Move my c, right? So x squared plus 2x plus something equals negative 4 plus my new c. Here's one that could not have been factored, right? What's my new c? 2 divided by 2 squared is 1. So make sure I add it to both sides. That's why I get into the habit of writing that blank space on both sides, because that's the number one mistake students make, is they only add it to one side. So that gives me x plus 1 squared equals negative 3. Solve it. Square root x plus 1 equals plus or minus I square root 3. That's all I can do there. Subtract 1. And x equals negative 1 plus or minus I square root 3. And I am pretty much...
Okay, I'm going to do the last example here so you have it. We're going to get all of the variables on one side. So I'm going to subtract the 5x squared and add the 6x. Minus the 5x squared and add the 6x. We get 3x squared plus 18x plus 24 equals 0. Now I don't have a perfect square here, so I'm going to divide everything by the coefficient 3. So I have x squared plus 6x plus 8 equals 0. Again, not a perfect square, so we're going to subtract the 8. We're going to move our c to the other side. X squared plus 6x plus something equals negative 8 plus something. That something will be our new c. 6 divided by 2 squared. 3 squared is 9, so my new c is 9. I get x plus 3 squared. X squared plus 6x plus 9 factors to x plus 3 squared equals 1. And we take the square root of both sides, plus or minus, in front of the square root of the 1. X plus 3 equals plus or minus 1. Remember that the square root of 1 is just 1. Minus the 3. And x equals negative 3 plus or minus 1. Which means negative 3 plus 1, which is negative 2, and negative 3 minus 1, negative 4. So x is negative 2 and negative 4.